Hello, hello, hello. Good evening, everybody. How's things? How is life? Hope everybody is doing well, surviving the stay-at-home order, right? Whatever. Hope you're staying busy, in some capacity. Read a book, bake some bread. I don't know. I've learned how to make a mean focaccia, so I can send you the recipe for that if you'd like to know it. It's really super easy to make. But anyways, tonight we are going to be taking a look at the nervous system. Right, we got through the musculoskeletal system. Right, first the skeleton, then we got through the muscles, and here's where we're going to start to look at one of the more complex systems in the body. Right now, muscles, right, bones. It's not that they are not complex. However, right, they don't hold a candle to that of the nervous system. Right, we, as much as we know about the nervous system, right, there is just as much, if not more, that we don't know about the nervous system. Right, the way that neurons actually connect. Well, we know how they interact with one another, but just the extent in which they do so. Right? How is it the brain can compute the massive amount of information that it receives on a second-by-second basis? Right? And how is it that can impact your heart rate or your breathing rate, or how that can impact the blood vessels in the skin? There is so much which can be controlled by the nervous system. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is just an overview of just the nervous system in general. Right, the nervous system, again, that comprises really chapters 12 through 16. So there's 5 chapters, right, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, that make up the nervous system. And chapter 17 in special senses, we'll cover that as well. But right, when we talk about the nervous system, it can be kind of broken down into 2 larger categories. There is the central nervous system. Right, the central nervous system is the central nervous system being the brain. Right, the brain and the spinal cord. Right, those 2 things, and come on, computer, stay with me. There we go. Right, those 2 things, right, make up the central nervous system. That's the brain and the spinal cord. Any nervous tissue outside of that, any nerves, any neurons, right, you hit your funny bone, right, all of the nerves outside of the brain and the spinal cord are a part of what is called the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. Do not say that quickly, because it sounds like a completely different body part, right? The PNS, the peripheral nervous system. Right now we see cranial nerves, spinal nerves, enteric plexus, sensory receptors. Yeah, our brain is, I'm not going to say our brain's dumb, because it's not. However, when you think about it from this standpoint, the reason why our brain makes the decisions that it does, or the reason why it has the capability to make the decisions that it does, has entirely to do with the information that it is sent via these, for instance, the receptors in the skin. Right, you put your hand in some cold water. The only reason your brain can make you pick your hand up out of that water is because initially the receptors in your skin told the brain, hey, you've got your hand in some cold water, you don't like that, pick your hand up. Right? That is obviously incredibly cliff noting it. Right? However, right, that kind of pathway from the receptors in the organs, the receptors in the skin, that pathway from the receptor all the way up to the head. Now, when I say receptor, think of a receptor as being a detector. Or you have touch detectors in your skin. You have vibration detectors. You have temperature detectors. We just don't call them detectors. We call them receptors. right? You have thermoreceptors, thermo, temperature, receptors. All right, you have receptors for temperature. All right, you have touch receptors. There's things called mechanoreceptors. They respond to mechanical energy. Right? Think about squeezing a plastic bottle. As you squeeze that plastic bottle, it changes shape. Same idea with some of these receptors. As you, for instance, just take your finger and push it into the table, you can envision how your finger kind of deforms in shape. Well, guess what happens to the receptors inside of the pad of your finger? They change shape as well. Right? So we're going to go into, right, how is it these receptors, or how is it these detectors can detect the different sensations that they do. Right? Now, within the peripheral nervous system, again, we see cranial nerves, we see spinal nerves. Right? Nerves and neurons are not synonymous. Right? A neuron is an individual nerve cell. A nerve is thousands of neurons. Right? A neuron, for instance, carries information one way. Right? I'm just going to draw I'm not drawing a star, I'm actually drawing a neuron. They look something kind of like this. Right? And information, or the nerve impulse, travels one way down the neuron. One way. In a nerve, there's, let's say, thousands of these. Right? Thousands of these. And a nerve is like Interstate 81. Right? There's 81. All right, well, there's a northbound and a southbound. Absolutely. Right? A little bit later on, we're going to talk about different types of neurons. Some carry sensory information, meaning some neurons transmit the sense of touch to the brain. And there are some neurons which carry motor information, meaning those are the neurons which are carrying the information from the brain out to the muscles of the hand, for instance, which tell the muscles of the hand to make a fist. Right? So, in a nerve, right, there's both motor and sensory neurons. But each individual neuron only carries either or. Right? So either, right, a neuron is either carrying sensory information or it's carrying motor information. But in a nerve, there are thousands of neurons, some of which are carrying motor information, some of which are carrying sensory information, just like Interstate 81. Right? Interstate 81, however, there's a northbound lane and there's a southbound lane. Right? There's a sensory lane and there's a motor lane. Right? So we can see, right, when we break down, right, this from this view, you can break down the nervous system into these different compartments, into these different divisions, if you want to call them that. Right, what we see here, somatic senses, special senses. Yeah, all this purple here, right? Everything in this box, right, is a part of the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. Right, all of it, within the purple box. So the somatic senses and the special senses. Yeah, think of somatic senses a little bit later on when we talk about these. But yeah, your sense of touch, temperature, right, vibration. Those are all different types of somatic. Excuse me. Excuse me. Somatic senses. They travel from those receptors or from those detectors. They travel up eventually into the brain. And then your brain makes a decision. Oh, I put my hand in some cold water. These receptors here were stimulated. They then send an impulse up to certain parts of the brain. The brain says, oh, my hand is in a pool of water. Now my brain has to make a decision. I don't want my hand in this cold water anymore. So my brain has to say, okay, I want to pick my hand up out of the water. Now that may seem like a very simple process, but that is a unbelievably complex task with a series of checks and balances. Right? First you have to decide what you want to do. And then your brain has to initiate, well, first it has to program what it, then it has to program what it wants to do. Right? There's different parts of the brain that we'll get to quite a while from now. Something called it's the precentral gyrus, it's the motor cortex, which is, it is where your, for instance, make a fist right now, for instance, right, point a finger, right, take your toes and kind of spread your toes apart. All of that originated in the motor cortex, right, but it's not like that nerve signal went from the motor cortex and only went down to the muscles of your hand, for instance, if you're making a fist. It went to so many different parts of the brain. Right here, probably in about an hour or so, we're going to look at some of the different pathways that these neurons have to travel through. Right, but before we get to that, the reason why there's so many different potential pathways is when we look at the motor component or the motor output of the central nervous system. There's the somatic division, which that is what controls skeletal muscle. That's it. The somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscle movement, period. Done. Move on. Now the other compartment, or the other division, is what's called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, think of that as being like the automatic nervous system. These are things which just automatically happen. Right? Well, the somatic nervous system regulates skeletal muscle function. Don't make a fist. Take your right hand and just lay it out flat. Alright. Has it moved? Have you made a fist yet? No. It didn't automatically happen. You had to actually, alright, now think about making a fist. Oh, look at that. I just made a fist. I actually had to cause and make that happen. There are so many things behind the scenes that occur without your knowledge of. Right? Take whatever food you're eating. Take a bite of food. Take a sip of coffee. Take a sip of, preferably not soda, but hey, you know what? The hell with it. We're all in lockdown. You want to drink some Coke, Pepsi? Preferably Pepsi, but, Coke will work in a pinch. Drink whatever you want. But, right, when you think about it, when you eat something, whatever it is, alright, you think about putting it in your mouth, you then chew it around, and then you swallow it. Do you think about it after that? Right, I mean, yeah, you might, let's say if you went to Taco Bell, yeah, at about half an hour, you'll be thinking about, everybody in the room will be thinking about what the hell it was you just ate, right? But you don't think about what's going on behind the scenes. I swallowed it, okay, done, moving on. Well, all of the different stomach acid which was secreted, all of the different digestive enzymes which were secreted, right, in my mouth, the saliva that I'm producing. I don't think about producing any of that stuff. It just automatically happens. It just happens. Right? Well, it can just randomly just happen. And it doesn't just randomly happen. Right? That's where the autonomic nervous system comes into play. Right? It's all regulated, the autonomic nervous system. Now if you're like, well, wait a second, I thought it was regulated via the peripheral nervous system. That is a compartment, that's a piece of it, right? There, the two big ones, there is the peripheral nervous system, and there is the central nervous system. Central nervous system is simple in that there is the central nervous system, that's it. The peripheral nervous system, that can get chopped up and broken down into 15 different ways. Right? Right, just like a house, you go into a house, right? let's imagine the peripheral nervous system is the house. I walk into a house, and all of a sudden, this house has, let's just say, 8 different rooms. Each individual room is like a different division of the nervous system. I'm still in the peripheral nervous system. Right? Think of it. If a house is a peripheral nervous system, I walk into a house, there's 8 different rooms. Yeah, each different compartment or each different room is a different division of the nervous system. Does that make sense? So don't get lost and say, wait a second, somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, I don't get it. I thought there was just like the nervous system. There is, right? Just like the house is the house. But when you go inside of the house, there's a kitchen, there's a bathroom, right? There's a dining room, there's a living room, right? There's a a bedroom, right? Same idea, right? Making up the peripheral nervous system are just different pieces, different portions, different divisions, right, of the nervous system which make it up. Alright, cool. So there's different automatic functions which happen. So this one here, the sympathetic nervous system. Alright, so this is, I'm trying to think of a scary movie I watched recently. I think it was called In the Tall Grass. Really just not scary even remotely. It's on Netflix. Not even a little bit. So it's kind of an odd movie. Just think of somebody scaring the crap out of you. My oldest daughter, right, she loves to scare people. She's not terribly good at it. In fact, like she will watch her come into the room, and she'll then go up behind you and then scream and try to scare you. And you react not because you're scared, but because you're just, you're not deaf, right? But think of something scares you. Think of the reaction. What happens? All right, somebody scares you. All right, heart starts to race. Your breathing starts to race. You get this kind of heightened sense of just everything, right? Those are some of the things that you're aware of, right? Other things. Your body has begun to mobilize glucose, right? Your body has begun to vasodilate or make blood vessels larger, which go to some of the larger muscle groups in the body, like the quadriceps, like the various muscle groups of the leg and the lower extremity. It's constricted the blood vessels leading to the intestines. It's constricted the blood vessels leading to the kidneys. Right? You didn't think about any of that stuff, but yet it all still happened. The parasympathetic nervous system does kind of the opposite. Right? When I say kind of the opposite, yeah. If the sympathetic nervous system kind of, get your heart racing, get your respiratory rate elevated, right? So we commonly call it the fight or flight, for those of you that have taken psych before, or are currently, right, concurrently. Parasympathetic nervous system is like rest and digest. Right? Those times of just very low kind of activity. Just kind of go with the flow. Right? Sitting in class. Which you're not sitting in class, but you get my point. After a large meal. Right? Parasympathetic nervous system, that regulates bowel and bladder function, for instance. So when you increase parasympathetic nervous system activity, that increases intestinal motility. That increases gastric secretions. Right? When you increase parasympathetic nervous system activity, right? It increases think of it kind of being like a much more relaxed state. Right? Anytime you're kind of stressed out, worrying, anxious, overworked, those sorts of things. That's all when there's an increase in sympathetic tone. Now there's very much a yin-yang between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. One ramps you up and one ramps you down. Right? It's not like all of a sudden you can just, oh, something scares the crap out of me. And, oh man, somebody just scared the bejesus out of me. Okay, it's not like, oh, the sympathetic nervous system wore off. No. What happened is, think about it, when somebody scares you, your body ramps up the sympathetic nervous system. Well, it's a yin-yang. It's like a balancing, right? Let's say here's a teeter-totter. That's a triangle. Let's say, or not a teeter-totter, excuse me, seesaw. There's a handle. There's little Johnny hanging out of the seesaw. Yep, could you tell that, can you tell you've been locked down for a while? So this is a seesaw, right? As one side goes up, the other side has to go down. Has no choice. Absolutely must happen. So let's imagine this is a sympathetic nervous system. Let's imagine this is a parasympathetic nervous system. As one goes up, the other must come down. Has no choice. Somebody scares the crap out of you. Body ramps up the sympathetic nervous system. Right? So when that happens, the parasympathetic nervous system ramps down. Awesome. Cool. Well, it's not like all of a sudden, oh, just like the parasympathetic nervous system wore off. Like, what had to happen in order to come down off of that high? Let's just call it, that high of just being terrified. What has to happen is your body has to begin to elevate your parasympathetic nervous system. So as that happens, your sympathetic nervous system, which was way up here, starts to normalize. And now we have this, balanced out parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. This is why somebody, people, right? Whoever. You think about it, what happens when you just get super scared? Somebody just, oh my God, just terrifies you. What do? Right? You can say, I've never had anybody actually scare me before like that. Well, in movies, just think about it. You can believe everything you see in movies. Come on, it's all real. When I watched this one, well, never mind. Right? But what happens when somebody scares you? I mean, really scares you. Something you always see from people, in movies, for instance, is people wet themselves. Right? Why? Right, well, think about it. Well, another one. Right? I gotta pee like a racehorse. Is that a legitimate thing? Absolutely, 100%. Right? And why is that? How I mentioned it is all a yin-yang kind of relationship. It's all a balance between the two. So, your parasympathetic nervous system, how I mentioned, that's what regulates your bowel and bladder function. That's what regulates it. Alright. So if somebody just scared the loving crap out of me, right, sympathetic nervous system goes through the roof. Parasympathetic nervous system has to go down. Has no choice. Remember how I mentioned? It's like a seesaw. If Johnny goes up, George, whoever, Sally must come down. No choice. Well, your parasympathetic nervous system goes to such a low extent that it now is unable to regulate bladder function. And, don't worry, I'm not going to draw a picture of it, but it crossed my mind. But your bladder function, you lose bladder function and control, and you pee yourself, or you urinate. Right? That's because your sympathetic nervous system has elevated and has taken over, and your parasympathetic nervous system has essentially shut off. Right? That's how terrified you are. So, again, that's how I mentioned there is a very fine balance between these two. So these here, right, this is kind of just here where, let me get these markings off here. Whereas here, there's just boxes, right, arrows, that sort of thing. This image here, this is where we're actually seeing like some of the different types and styles of neurons. We haven't covered them yet. We will. Just coming up next. But these are what some of the neurons inside of the body look like. Right? The only reason you can see what you can see, the only reason you can see the screen right now, right? The only reason is because of the photoreceptors inside of your eye. There's little tiny light detectors inside of your eye. Right? The light from the screen enters into the eye. That light hits those photoreceptors or those light detectors, and then the neurons transmit that sensation back to the occipital lobe, or the part of the brain which is going to essentially decode what it is you are seeing. The only reason you can hear what I'm hearing right now is because as the microphone vibrates, creates sound waves, those sound waves hit this little tiny membrane inside of the ear, eventually causing little tiny neurons to send impulses into the brain to a specific part of the brain which is designated to decode what you're hearing. As you grab your mouse, right, or as you hit the arrow key, or as you grab your phone to check Facebook right now as I'm talking, whatever it is, right, when you feel something, the reason you can feel it is because those little tiny touch receptors, right, or those touch detectors inside of your skin, right, are when you grab something, or you touch something, those little touch receptors are being stimulated, and they send a little nerve message all the way up to the specific part of your brain which decodes that message. And this here, right, this is just a Cliff Notes version of, right, the nerve, or excuse me, the neuron here, and that touch detector or receptor, sending that nerve message or that nerve impulse through a series of different neurons. Right? The brain would be somewhere, right? Well, I mean, this is the central nervous system, so, right, this is the spinal cord, right, in the brain. It's an awful end. Right? But this is, again, this is a very simplistic view, but this is, I mean, right, when you look at it, this is what actually occurs. You have the sensory neuron sending that nerve impulse through the spinal cord up to the brain. From the brain, it then sends down a response. Right? The response is carried out via these motor neurons, and it goes to the specific organ or gland that's to be affected. So, in order to carry these things out, right, neurons have to be organized. They have to be kind of comprised. They have different structures. They have different features. Right, some of them are very similar to what we had learned, 2 months ago at this point. 2.5 months ago, probably. Right, 10 weeks ago, call it. This is what a neuron looks like. Right, neurons are enormous, gigantic, massively large. Right. Here are some other cells. You can see how small these things are. Just think of how many of these we could fit inside of that. Oh my god, I don't even, 100? 200? Right? Neurons are massive. And part of the reason why neurons are massive is because they can have sometimes thousands of different, they can have thousands of other neurons attaching to them. That at the moment might not make sense. Don't worry, later on, probably today, we'll talk about that. Right, but some of the different structures, right, that we're going to look at. Again, the cell body. Actually, let's first start in the middle, right? The nucleus. Right, this thing here. It's all nucleus. Right, cell body. That's just the soma, right? What's called the soma or the cell body, same thing, right? Choice is yours, right? Cell body, soma, all these things out here. This one here, 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 right? These are all what are called dendrites. These are all called dendrites. These dendrites would go out and actually attach to other surrounding. So let's imagine there was another neuron. Right here. You would see eventually this dendrite wrapping around and actually would attach to this specific neuron. And this neuron here, right, this neuron would have its own dendrites coming off. Right, it would have its own dendrites coming off. And you would see this dendrite coming up and wrapping around and attaching itself, again, to this particular neuron. Right, so that's the purpose of these dendrites. That's the handshake. I know, can't be doing that nowadays. Right, no handshakes, no hugs. Right, but that's the handshake between neurons. Right. Now, the dendrite of, let's think here. How, actually, now that I kind of look at my image, I actually had this kind of drawn backwards. When you think about a neuron, let me draw this better. On this particular neuron that I just drew, it's a good neuron. It's beautiful. This big long tail thing here, that's the axon. That's what this is way down here. This here is something called the axon. This is the big long tail of a neuron, which then that nerve message travels down to reach the next cell. So in the image I had drawn 30 seconds ago, right, when I drew it up in here, I actually kind of drawn it backwards. Right? So what actually happens is the dendrites, right, the dendrites of this neuron would not attach to the dendrites of this neuron. The dendrites of this first neuron, right, they attach with the preceding neuron. Here, in this picture, right, this neuron here, right, its dendrites would actually be attaching to what are called the axon terminals of the preceding neuron. Right, just like I've drawn here. Right, so for instance, if I drew out, let's just imagine, I'm going to draw the next neuron. I don't know what the heck that is. Call that a neuron. Axon. Cool. So this neuron's got dendrites coming out, dendrites coming out, dendrites coming out. Okay. Of this neuron, this axon would continue. Let's just imagine this axon comes down to about here. This is where it ends. At the end of this axon, there are all these little what are called axon terminals, which come and sprout outwards. Guess what would happen? That's where they go and attach to. Where these axon terminals would attach themselves to the dendrites of the next cell, right, of the next neuron. Now, sometimes it's not always the neuron it's attaching to, right? We'll talk more about that as we start to talk about different neurons. But sometimes, right, each neuron, if, for instance, it's a neuron which goes to control the muscles of your hand, right? Instead of me drawing a neuron, right, I could have drawn a muscle cell. the skeletal muscle cell, the striations. Right, you get my point. Right, so it depends on what, where we're talking about in the body. But it's these axon terminals which go out and attach themselves to the particular cell. When it's a muscle cell, for instance, it generates something called a neuromuscular junction. We will talk about that. We'll get to it later on today. Right, we'll talk about that. And we'll look at some of the different structures and some of the different features which exist. Right, but before we get to that, we're going to look at some of the other kind of structures of a neuron. So this here, right, when we look at this, just like we saw before, right, this all through here, this is all right, cell body, or what's called the soma. Same thing, choice is yours, whichever one you want to call it. All right. The dendrites we saw, right, all these kind of little hands or fingers that should come out, saw all those before. Right, the nucleus, we saw that a moment ago. The cytoplasm, right, the cytoplasm is identical to that of the cytoplasm that we talked about in any number of the other body cells from chapter 3. Right, remember the cytoplasm? That's the liquid portion, and as well as when we talk about the different organelles. Right, remember we talked about the organelles, like those tiny organs of a cell. Right, our body. We know our body has different organs, like the heart, the spleen, the pancreas, the kidney, the lungs, etc. Right. Well, our cells have kind of the same thing. They're just not called organs. They're called organelles. Right. So, one of the next portions, we see right here, something called the axon hillock. Now, this can also be called what's called the trigger zone. This is hugely important. This is where the nerve impulse is generated. Okay, makes sense. Right, think about it. Cells in the body don't have a light switch. I walk into a room. I want the lights to turn on. Alright, no problem. I go up to the light switch, I flip it up, or, since I installed them upside down in my house, I flip them down. I think I did it just to piss off my wife. But that's okay. That's okay. Right? You flip a switch. It's that easy. Neurons, you can't just flip a switch. Or just cells in the body. Right? In general, you just can't flip a switch. You've got to do something. Right? A little bit later on, we're going to talk about how you actually do that. And it actually has to do with changing the charge of the cell. Right? Like literally change, like if we talk about like a voltmeter, like a voltage meter, if I stuck in, a voltage meter into a cell, it would actually render a charge. Right? So that process we're going to talk about later on. But when we talk about this particular neuron generating that nerve impulse, right, to travel down the axon, right down here, it is generated in the axon hillock. This is where it's generated, the axon hillock. The axon hillock. Okay. Some of the features, structures that we see traveling down along the axon. Again, this big, right, the yellowish tube. The yellowish tube that we see, that's all axon. Like, well, what about these like hot dog bun looking things that surround it? Are those a part of it? No, they surround the axon. Right. These things called Schwann cells, right? This is a nucleus here. This is a cell. This is a Schwann cell. Right. These Schwann cells produce something called the myelin sheath. this here, this entire thickness is the myelin sheath, right? From here all the way through to here. That is the myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath is important later on. We're going to look at something called, or look at a process called saltatory conduction. You're like, what the hell is that? Different things exist to cause these nerve messages to travel more slowly or more quickly. Right? We all know, rubber, right, doesn't conduct electricity. Wood doesn't conduct electricity. Certain metals conduct electricity like crazy fast. Others not so fast, not so much. Perhaps heat's a better example. Right? Some things are a great conductor of heat. Right? Metal is a great conductor of heat. Right? Wood, not so much. Air is a horrible conductor of heat. Right? So it really, right, these myelin sheaths can drastically impact the speed in which this nerve message can travel. Right? And the process that they essentially kind of allow, or they kind of cause to be created, is something called saltatory conduction. We will look at that again, don't worry. In between the myelin sheaths, we see this thing here, 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 here. Those are called nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier. Right. And it's a little space that exists between the Schwann cells. Right? It's not like there's just one Schwann cell which wraps the entire axon. Nope. You can see this one Schwann cell, right, goes from here to here. Right? This next Schwann cell begins here. There's a little space. Ends here, begins here. There's a little space. Right? That little space allows something to enter into, and that's what's going to help speed up the signal. But don't worry, if you're chomping at the bit, we're not going to get into it just yet. Right? But that space is going to be hugely important. All right. Next. Surrounding the axon, there's something called the axolemma. So if I just, I'm really going to try here. That took about as much focus as I've ever had. Okay, so again, this layering, I think it's better if I go faster. Okay. Right. This outermost layer of the axon, right, that's the axolemma. Right, that is the axolemma. The axolemma. Surrounding the outer portion, right on through here, out and through here, that's something called the neurolemma. Again, neurolemma. Right, neurolemma. Cool. So as I travel down, eventually I make it to the axon terminals. The axon terminals. Axon terminals. Cool. Now at the very end of the axon terminals is this little tiny bulb. That's the specific structure which is going to create the synapse with the next cell. Let's say if I just draw a miniature, whatever, I just draw a random cell. Let's call it a muscle cell. Right. It's that synaptic bulb right here which is actually going to create that neuromuscular junction. Right, so the fingers which kind of come out, those are the axon terminals. This end bulb, right, that is the synaptic end bulb. So again, we can see, right, a little bit closer of a view, how we talk about these Schwann cells. Now, One thing specific about Schwann cells, they exist in the peripheral nervous system. That's not to say that myelin doesn't exist in the, or that's not to say that myelin only exists in the peripheral nervous system, because it doesn't. Right? It also exists in the central nervous system. However, it is a different cell which produces it. Right? So in the peripheral nervous system, it's the Schwann cell which is going to produce the myelin. So because of this, because there is myelin present on a huge number of neurons, these are different sections of the brain and of the spinal cord. You can see it called white matter and gray matter. Yep. The white matter is primarily composed up of myelinated axons. A couple of reasons why. Really one reason why. Myelin is just fat. Right? Myelin is composed up of a variety of lipids. If you've ever eaten a steak, piece of chicken, bacon, pulled pork, turkey, venison. Well, venison's so lean, it doesn't seem like turkey, but if you've ever seen fat on a piece of meat, what color is it? Oh, it's white. It's like a whitish yellowish. Right? It's more white than it is yellow. Yeah. So it kind of makes sense that we call it white matter. That's why it has this whitish appearance, because of the predominance of the myelinated axons. Now you might say, all right, well, gray matter. Oh, gray matter just must be unmyelinated axons. And albeit that's true, sometimes it is unmyelinated axons. The other thing about the gray matter is it is actually the cell body of the neuron. Right, so let's just imagine if I just kind of drew it. Again, I'm really kind of drawing in a overly simplified image of this, but imagine like the cell body of the neuron being here. Out here in the white matter would be the axon, or like the axon terminals, that sort of thing. Again, there is trillions of neurons in the brain, right? So don't think that they're not, obviously it's nowhere near that big, right? But the cell body, that's what exists in the gray matter. So when we, right, continue kind of breaking down and compartmentalizing these neurons, right, we've got to get that nerve message from the receptor or the detector. We've got to get that to the brain. So there's got to be this just, right, hierarchy or this highly organized, succinct way to do that. And there is, right? Even in the, right, with the neurons. All right, sorry about that. So there's got to be this way for the brain or the body to organize the neurons to make sure that the appropriate neurons get from point A to point B. Right? So even within the individual nerves themselves, this is kind of what they look like, right? And if you think back to, if you're like, oh, this picture kind of looks familiar, yeah, it does. It looks very similar to that of the muscles in the muscular system, right? With each individual neuron, right? Take a bundle of those neurons, and that makes a fascicle. If I take a bunch of different fascicles and then package them together, that forms a nerve. Really the same idea in the muscular system. Muscular system, you had those muscle fibers, right? Take a bunch of those, bundle them together. That was a fascicle. Take a bunch of fascicles. Now we have a muscle. Some of the layers that we see here, right, surrounding each neuron is something called the endoneurium. The endoneurium. Surrounding each fascicle, remember, a fascicle is just a bunch of individual neurons. But the perineurium, that surrounds the fascicle. Lastly, something called the epineurium. That's going to surround the entirety of the nerve itself. This is the case regardless of what the neuron or what the nerve is. Whether it is, the nerves of your hand, that your uncle, oh man, I've got carpal tunnel or whatever it is, to, I just hit my funny bone and my hand's kind of going all tingly and pins and needles, or, oh man, I got the sciatica, oh, I got pain going down the back of my leg. Doesn't matter what nerve it is. They all have this general makeup. So again, whether it is these larger spinal nerves or some of the smaller branches which come out here into the arm, it doesn't matter. They all have that same general kind of characteristic. Now, one thing to remember, right? These neurons. Let's say here's the hand. Ooh, I'm gonna try and draw a hand. I shouldn't. I'll try and draw upside down. Thumb. Whoops, that was. I'm gonna give it one more shot. Yes, that was supposed to be a hand. Yeah, I get my point. That's close. That's not bad. The hand's not very good, but that's a hand. All right, so I put my hand in something, or I touch something with my index finger here. That impulse, that sensation has to go all the way up the arm, all the way up right forearm, up the arm, and depending on where it enters into, or depending on what part of my finger it touched, it's going to enter into a particular nerve. Enters into a nerve, into the spinal cord, then eventually up to the brain. Okay. So when I say a particular nerve, yeah, it all depends on what nerve it is, right? Think of it this way. If you are on Interstate 81, for instance, or either way, if you want to get onto or off of the interstate, there are specific exits that you need to do that through. Right? You can't just, I take whatever road I want, and then eventually it's going to lead me to the highway, or vice versa. I can take whatever exit I want, and eventually I can get to the highway I want, or I can get to the side street that I want. It doesn't work like that. Same exact thing with the nerves inside of the body. Right? Specific nerves. For instance, right, if it were the middle of the palm, let's say this area of the hand right here. Right, anything coming from this sensation as well as in through the finger here. Right, that's going to be traveling around C6, C7 spinal nerve. Meaning, if I go all the way up in here, well, here is C6, C7 here. So what that means is this sensation is going to travel all the way up the arm, and it's going to enter into those two specific nerves, what are called spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, those are the on-ramps and off-ramps. Right. You want to get onto Interstate 81, you've got to find an on-ramp, get on the on-ramp, and then merge into 81, merge onto the highway. Same exact thing here. I enter into the spinal nerve, or right? The on-ramp or the spinal nerve, and that enters me into the spinal cord, which is the actual highway. Cool. And the reason why is because, remember, that exact nerve down here, right, in the hand, which I just erased, but that's okay. Right, the specific receptor that you stimulated has an exact part of the brain that it goes to stimulate. When that exact part of the brain is stimulated, my brain then knows, hey, there is something touching the exact outside tip of my right finger, my right index finger. But in order to do that, we've got to, again, compartmentalize, and we have to organize, right, the different nerves. So there's something called the cervical plexus. That's C1 to C5, meaning that's the first through fifth spinal nerve levels. 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, you don't have to be able to count each one of these. It's not important whatsoever. Right. But cervical plexus, right? That's going to go up to feed, right, to be responsible for a number of the muscles kind of up in through here, as well as sensation to the back of the head, the scalp, that sort of thing. The brachial plexus, that's this group from here all the way down and through here, right? All of these nerves which kind of come out. The brachial plexus, if you think about your hand, your forearm, your arm, any nervous tissue, any neuron in your upper extremity comes from the brachial plexus, period. Right? It comes from the brachial plexus. That's where it comes from. The thoracic nerves. Alright, so, T1 to T12, right, they correspond with, right, the 12 thoracic vertebrae, right, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 thoracic nerves. Okay, moving on. The lumbar plexus. Alright. Lumbar plexus we see as L1 to L4. Same idea, right, the plexi from, right, L1 to L4 region, again, deals with a number of things, right? Muscles of the quadriceps, sensation of the quads itself. Right? Where I'm not going to cover, what individual spinal nerve levels are responsible for what muscle groups, because there is so much overlap, it's not even funny. Right? The sacral plexus, right? L4 to S4. Again, the sacral plexus, that's L4, L5 spinal nerves, S1, S2, S3, and then S4. Now, I say spinal nerves. Yeah, these are the spinal nerves. Those are the right nerves which combine to then feed into the spinal cord or to carry nerves out of the spinal cord. Right? There are thousands and thousands of neurons and nerves in the body. You can't just have thousands of nerves all dumping into the spinal cord. It's not possible. It's not feasible. So what happens? These neurons, right, join together, and they make larger nerves. And then those nerves join together and make larger nerves, until eventually they feed, or they turn into a spinal nerve. Again, this big thing here. Right, this spinal nerve here. And then those spinal nerves feed directly into the spinal cord. One of the things that we can see with the spinal cord, remember, the spinal cord, that is the connection, right, between your body and the brain, right? From the spinal cord, eventually it would continue on upwards, and eventually would enter, it would kind of transform into the brain, kind of, sort of, right, through the brainstem. So any sensory information, any sensation that we feel, right? Remember how I mentioned the brain's kind of dumb. It's not dumb, but it's got to be told things, right? These receptors, these detectors, send messages to the brain to tell the brain what's going on. Well, excuse me. They send messages to the brain. They don't even know what message. They just know that they're sending messages to the brain. The brain is what then decodes those messages, right? If that makes sense, right? Because it's that specific part of the brain which is stimulated, which that specific part of the brain is, when it's stimulated, that's how we know, again, the outside portion of your index finger on your left hand is being touched, for instance. So the spinal cord, in order to get up to the brain, the nerves have to enter into the spinal cord. They have no choice, right? Now, there's a very small group of specialized nerves which can and do bypass the spinal cord. There's only 12 of them, and they are the minority, right? So 99% of the time, if nerves want to enter into the brain, they first have to enter into the spinal cord, and they do that via the spinal nerves. Now, vice versa. If I'm in the brain, and I am a motor neuron, meaning I want to then go and cause your hand to make a fist, I have to go from the motor cortex, I have to leave the brain, travel down the spinal cord, travel out of the spinal nerve, and go out into the muscle of the hand. Does that make sense? So whether I want to get into or out of the spinal cord, I have to do that via a spinal nerve. That's why I kind of mentioned the spinal nerves are like the on-ramps and off-ramps, right? If the spinal cord is Interstate 81, there's a northbound and a southbound lane. Either way, there's still on-ramps and off-ramps to get on and off. The ramps, those are the spinal nerves. Here. We can see how thin the spinal cord is. I can do a... Yeah, there we go. You can see how right through here, the spinal cord gets very thin. Or it is very thin. And all through here, man, it gets really just kind of thick and fat. And then it gets thin again. That's weird. I wonder why that happens. There's something called the brachial plexus. Remember, take 10 seconds and think about what the brachial plexus does. I had mentioned, any sensation you feel in your upper extremity. Go slam your fingers into a drawer, stab yourself with a pin, touch your phone, whatever. All of that sensation, all of that movement that occurred, and it's not just the movement that you thought of. Right? It's even some of the movements that you didn't think of. Right? Like the dilation of the blood vessels, for instance. Right? That sometimes can be carried through these nerves as well. So, when we look at the brachial plexus, think of all of the nervous tissue in the upper extremity, all of the neurons in the upper extremity. It's tremendous. So when it enters into the cord, it's doing so through the brachial plexus. It's doing so at this level. So the spinal cord, because of all of the huge amount of nervous tissue and neurons entering into the spinal cord, it has to thicken. It has no choice. Right? If you have 1,000 cars merging onto the highway, you better have more lanes in that, on that highway at that exact spot, or else those extra 1,000 cars aren't going to fit. Same exact idea here. It's not the only place you see it. Down here in the lumbar enlargement. Now, one of the fascinating things, I gotta draw an arrow here for a second. Here. The tip, the ending of the spinal cord, is something called conus medullaris. Conus medullaris. Now, that does not end at the kind of the bottom of the back. It ends at L12, right? Basically, the space between your first and second lumbar vertebrae. It's fascinating. Your spinal cord doesn't go down the entire length of your back. It stops. Think of L1 and 2. It's about the kind of where the top part of the swallow of your back is, right? So it's higher up than you would think, right? Or maybe not. Right? It's definitely but one of the things that happens because of that, right? We see the lumbar enlargement. Well, if this red mark here, if this is L12, what about all these other spinal nerves from L2, L3, L4, L5, L6, L7? Yeah, L6, L7. Hello. I just got so excited to count. Right, L2, 3, 4, and 5, sacral nerves from S1 to S5. Like, what happens to them? They still exist. Right, they exist. Right, but they actually come out of the cord prior. Right, they start to exit the cord way up here at that level of T10, T11, T12. When they do that, they then form this big group of nerves. So you can envision, I mentioned, right, all the lumbar nerves, the sacral nerves, the coccygeal nerves. There's dozens. There's about a dozen of them, which all come out of the cord. And they come out of the cord, they then wrap around and they make this bundle of nerves. This bundle of nerves that they create right here, that's something called the cauda equina. Right? Think of horsetail. Right? So they create this cauda equina, and then when they get to their respective level, they then branch and split off. Right? For instance, the L4 spinal nerve. Right? When it gets to the L4 spinal level, it branches off. It branches off. So the cauda equina gets a little bit smaller. Right? When L5 branches off, S1 branches off, S2, so on and so forth. Right? Branches off and it gets a little bit smaller, a little bit smaller. Right? But the same idea is true from, as far as the cervical enlargement to that of the lumbar enlargement. There's all of this huge additional amount of nervous tissue, neurons from the lower extremity, which have to be accounted for. So because of that, that's where we then have the lumbar enlargement. One other thing, I forgot to mention the filum terminale, right? Just like you want to have, right, the reason why the organs are suspended inside of the body, in the positions, in the placement that they are, is all the different connective tissue which is attached to them. Same thing here for the filum terminale, right? It actually anchors itself to the the spinal nerves and to the spinal cord and anchors it in place. Here is the spinal cord. We're going to kind of blow it up and take a look at it, and you can see some of the different structures which are prevalent. The white matter, which all I did was introduce the white matter a little while ago. You see white matter. You see these little tiny kind of branches coming out through here. You see this big bulbous thing looking like this. This is the next part of what we're going to get into. Is right here. But before we do that, I'm actually going to, let's say for this particular video, just so I can start to encode it into MP4, I'm going to pause this video and then start up the next presentation on a fresh video.